I'm Molly, like mentioned, Senior Product Manager at Cobalt.
And I am Ruchira Agrawal, VP of Engineering at Plextrack. And before we jump into the content, I would love to understand who all are in the room. So please raise your hands. How many of you are on the offensive security side, red teaming, or pen testers in the room? Please raise your hands.
1, 2,
3.
all right. And a
So
half.
okay.
Okay.
Okay. And sure. How about consultants or service providers in the room? Anyone? 1, 2, 3. How many work for an enterprise type organization and do an in-house pen testing? 1, 2. Wow, a lot. And who else is here in the room outside of these 3 categories? Okay. The 3 things which we talked about: pen testers, consultants, MSSPs, enterprise type people working in the pen testing. Awesome. So
I got to get used to like mic, clicker. I'm doing it. So what are we talking about today? So we're chatting data and the role that data can play within your security programs. So the first thing we're going to chat through is how to go about capturing the data. And then we're going to chat about the importance and tactics and how to go about classifying the data. And then last but not least, we'll cover how do you really put that data to use? How do you start to derive some of those learnings, get an action plan in place, really with the backbone all being data. And then we're going to open it up for some Q&A. Before we dig in, I did want to acknowledge that there may be a slew of folks here, all on a different security maturity level. So some of you may already be looking at data and using that information proactively. And then some of you may just be kicking off your security programs in general. So hopefully you guys find some food for thought in this, but I did want to acknowledge we understand there are some different levels of security maturity programs out there. All right, so first up, let's chat about capturing your data. So I know what a few folks are doing when it comes to security and testing, but another quick raise of hands here. So who's all using pen test providers? Awesome. Who's using bug bounty programs?
What if you roll your own?
No, this is a safe space. What about continuous vulnerability scanning? Okay. And then breach and attack simulation? Okay. So obviously we'd love it if you worked at Cobalt for pen testing, but we get it. There are a lot of different options out there, a lot of different ways that we're doing security testing. I saw a few hands being raised for the same, for different questions. So people are using these pen test providers. They're using continuous vulnerability scanning. They're using the breach and attack simulation. That leads to a lot of data, all in kind of these different systems, different locations, these different silos. And there's tons of options out there. I mean, we have the Cobalters, the PTAS, we have the traditional pen testing programs, you have the boutique consultancies, the internal pen testing, the red teaming, attack surface management, vulnerability management, so many different options. Again, then this is just leading to data everywhere. Maybe it's in PDFs, maybe it's in spreadsheets, maybe it's all being exchanged over emails or Slack messages, or it could be anywhere and everywhere. So really the question here is, how can we move from this to something like this? How can we go about and really start to centralize that data, really thinking about your security as this full sort of theme and not just within one sort of silo?
And that's where the security lifecycle comes into play. As you guys are aware that in today's world, when we are developing millions and zillions of softwares, we keep adding bugs, fortunately and unfortunately, and organizations will use a variety of tools to capture the potential vulnerabilities, right? All the way from the bug bounty program to vulnerability scanners to the penetration testing tools. And having a view of your holistic vulnerabilities allows us to know about the complete coverage of your attack surfaces, And once you have all the data within the platform, you could use automations to either generate the reports in an automated fashion, or you could enable the service providers or the internal teams to collaborate and manage things from all the way from putting the vulnerabilities into the systems to remediations. And you can have all the tracking and managing the project workflows within the system itself. And this way you are avoiding exchanging any secure data over emails or spreadsheets. Now, as you guys are aware that the data improvements feed off of the data. Since we have all the data coming into our system, we can optimize our processes in an automated and repeatable fashion. The whole idea here is that if you want your new hire coming in, working with you, you would want to have the same process that person is following as a senior person in your company is, right? And since you have all the data within your system, you could have the analytics running behind the scenes to help provide an understanding about the ROI to your executives.
Perfect. So now we've gathered all of this data. We're starting to store it in this kind of centralized location. Now we need to ensure that those different data fields that are being passed, really mean the same thing, that there's some sort of shared language or shared definition when it comes to things like severity level. So there's this importance in being able to evaluate your findings and then normalizing some of that. Again, having that sort of common definition. So as you're kind of seeing all of the different sources pull into one, you could really start to prioritize your remediation efforts. So I'm curious, how are people kind of prioritizing their vulnerabilities, or what are different factors that come into play when you're evaluating those findings? What are folks doing today? Are we looking at CVSS scores? Are we? Yeah. Yep. What are some other factors that come into play?
Probably, I mean, I don't know, probably just internal assessments and just trying to figure out, how impactful like one application or one service might be if it were to go down or become compromised.
Yep.
Compared against like the risk appetite, the tolerance of the business side, see what they're willing to just accept or what they feel is important enough to remediate.
Totally. Yep. Comes to kind of my next slide here. So risk is, you guys just mentioned it, it's not like a one size fits all thing. What one vulnerability or a CVS score, you just can't use it as the only factor. There's a lot of different things that come into play when you're kind of evaluating your findings and your vulnerabilities. And I think this is a really critical part, is making sure that you are evaluating those findings. And again, making sure that as you have all of these different inputs that are coming into this centralized system, that you go ahead and you actually classify those according to your own standards. So at Cobalt, we use kind of this 5-tier rating system. It's pretty much an industry standard, but it does range critical to informational. And then this is determined just by factors like what we're just throwing out in the room. It's the likelihood and the impact. So all this to say, there's a bunch of different data out there that's going to help you prioritize this risk, but risk isn't that one size fits all. So there's kind of this manual sort of triaging, this evaluation that needs to happen in there, with a few outside factors that are unique to your own business. So you'll have to take the time to think through, is this vulnerability a true or false positive? What's that level of difficulty of exploitation? Could this be a direct exploit? And then, is this known? Is there a published exploit code? What would be that impact to the business if it were exploited? Are there some existing security controls that you guys already have in place that would maybe minimize some of this? So again, the point here is really, it's up to the organizations and up to you guys to figure out what that risk rating and what that level of prioritization and what that framework kind of looks like when evaluating it. And once you kind of have that information all aggregated, make sure to normalize that. Make sure all these different systems are classified according to your framework, really to help in that remediation effort and prioritization.
And this is where the process definition comes into play. As Nicole was talking before, and as Matthew, you also said just now, that it's quite important for every business, every company to know and have a clear understanding of what their business entails and what critical means to their specific organization. And what is the willingness to take the risk as an organization? We can't boil the ocean. And having an understanding that what we are willing to accept as a company, as an organization, so that our teams are not getting bogged down when it comes to talking about security. And everything really boils down, in my opinion, to having a clear understanding of what the business impact your specific organization can afford to have and what critical means to you. And with each system classifying vulnerabilities in the different ways at PlexTrack, we help normalize that information. We standardize the data coming from all the parsers or scanners to the findings data like date, title, description, remediation recommendations, assets, severity. And there could be some integrations which are providing us the CVE scores, CWE scores. We can map that data also within our system. And once we have all that information within our platform, you are getting an aggregated view of the vulnerabilities, and then you can slice and dice all the data by the assets type, by the date created, by the severity level. And this view gives you an ability to have the information centralized all within the single dashboard. And you can report out on the aggregated vulnerabilities.
Okay, so I think of the capture and classify as kind of the foundation. Like you have the infrastructure, you're getting the information in, but this last step is really how do you start to put that data to use? How do you start to utilize it? You know, I think this is really the baseline of knowing where you are today and then being able to see like, where do you need to be in 1 year? Where do you need to be in 3 years? And how do you kind of need to get there? And again, if you have the good infrastructure to go ahead and automate some of that capturing of the data, and then you have a good framework to classify it, being able to understand those benchmarks and the trend lines can really help you understand where you need to go and where you can go. Again, so you've already centralized all this. You understand some of your security trends. You've been capturing this data for a while, so you have those benchmarks in place. And like Ruchira mentioned, you're starting to be able to slice and dice that data according to what's important to you. Kind of either look at it from like assets, you could start looking at it from a team perspective, you could start, there's a lot of different categories that you could kind of slice the data in. To me, one of the most fascinating parts is always looking at data when you look at it over time. So when you start to look at it year over year, month over month, week over week, you're starting to kind of see where your trend lines lie. And again, having that ability to slice and dice the data will give you the ability to, get the reports that you really care about according to the metrics that matter. And some of the benefits that we've seen come out of just having those security benchmarks and trend lines is one, you could really start to see where your defenses are falling short. And then two, I think a big one is you could track not just remediation efforts, but track a lot of stuff over time. So you could report back and say, we used to be here. Now we're here. Third, evaluate effectiveness. I think there's a lot of evaluation when it comes to people, process, and technologies. What's working? What's not? How did we improve? How did we not improve? And having that data will really help you do that. And then this was mentioned a little bit earlier, Caroline, I think you had it as one of your top benefits, is like, how do you start thinking about security and use it as a competitive advantage? How are you comparing to your peers? And then last but not least, we touched on this earlier too, but demonstrate ROI. As Nicole mentioned, data can be really powerful when it comes to demonstrating some of that ROI. I know it's really hard to put dollar amounts on it. It's hard to quantify prevention, but having that data to sort of back up where you are and show what those trend lines look like can really help make security matter when it comes to ROI.
I love all the benefits which Molly just talked about, but I do have my personal favorites. Make security your competitive edge. If you notice, for any sales for a SaaS company, merger and acquisition, public events, there goes a huge tech due diligence, and security is a key part. Why do we have to put security on the back burners when we can be ahead in the curve and have no roadblocks? Every day, there are some different regulations that get put in place, and we don't want our business to slow down because of those new regulations. Demonstrate the ROI. The idea is that the security should be at the forefront of every business decision. As Nicole was talking about, don't have security as a back office function. That was a line literally which I took over on my deck. when I heard that. She's absolutely right that we have to have the cybersecurity business reviews. We have to involve our executive leadership so that we are talking this as a day-to-day function and not as an yearly function. So we need to have a buy-in from all the way from the executive teams to every person in the company.
Cool. So like we mentioned in that last slide, one of the key benefits here is really how can you start evaluating the effectiveness of your people, your process, and your technologies, your tools that you're using. And here's a quick example of how you can maybe put that into practice. So first is increasing your coverage. So traditionally with pen test reporting, you're getting just a snapshot in time. Where are you after you've run that pen test? And with PTAS, you're now able to combine that manual pen testing with the SaaS platform. So this allows you to get that org-wide view. You could see all of the different pen tests that are run on all of your different assets, all within your own organization. And then you see that over time. So again, you're able to start pulling out your program's effectiveness and some of your insights throughout your history.
And to layer on top, by using the integrations and the APIs, you can also start aggregating all the data in the centralized view. Once you have the holistic view of your assets, the testings that you have been doing, you can get a larger view of your attack surface. And by using the automation to aggregate your data, you are all keeping yourself up to date in finding the snapshot of those services in the real time. So when a new pen test is ran or when you are finding a new finding, it becomes easier for you to see everything in one dashboard for you. And you'll get a holistic view of the assets and overall security posture.
Yeah, I think another spot that you could start to look at is where can you use these trends to really help you hone in on your workflows and where can you kind of improve those? So as I think about trend lines and data, obviously, you'd like to see it look like this or like this, depending on whatever metric you're looking at. But the glory of tracking that over time is you have that benchmark and you have that baseline. And we are able to kind of see those upticks or downticks, and you could start to pinpoint changes. What your level of tolerance is depends on whatever you're tracking, but obviously you're able to start to see those changes. And that will allow you to kind of pause and say like, okay, something's not working here. Our time to remediate is increased by 20% compared to last month. Let's pause, let's reevaluate, let's see where maybe we can incorporate some technologies. One area that we've seen beneficial when it comes to workflows is things like Jira integration. How can you streamline your workflows by using your own ticketing systems and then making sure that whatever you update in Jira is updated within that system as well. So when you're ready to retest a finding, it gets into ready to retest in Jira, and it automatically hits that pen tester's plate. There's no manual there. So really thinking about how you could improve your workflows, but also use that data to back up any changes and say, okay, I changed it here. And you could help the data see where those upticks and benefits are coming from. And then the third kind of area here is where can you use this information to really shed some light and maybe introduce some additional education within your teams. This was mentioned a little bit earlier, and if you're seeing the same types of vulnerability types pop up over and over and over again, like maybe there needs to be a level of education and some additional training that's happening with the team. The idea is not to play a game of whack-a-mole over and over again, so how can you kind of be proactive and bring those learnings into your process?
You won't be able to completely remove the cyber risk, but you must measure your security efforts and create the thresholds to determine if they are improving, you are able to mitigate the risks, or you are able to decrease the risks. You have to align your metrics to your business objectives and consider the outcomes that you are measuring for. Every so often, ask the questions like, are we measuring these metrics to demonstrate that if we are strengthening our security posture? Or are we measuring to show that we have become a more efficient security team? Because without considering the outcomes, it's really, really challenging to show how security initiatives are helping the business succeed.
Yeah, this kind of brings me back to what Nicole was saying about having that business mind frame and being able to know what the business intent is, and then how could the security team help support that using the metrics and the data. So there's so much information out there, so much data, so many different metrics that you could pull in. And here's just a few examples of what you guys could be looking at and how they could maybe be used. So SLA management, so are your SLAs getting met? SLAs obviously help hold teams accountable. It kind of sees how your teams are doing in comparison to those SLAs. Helps you see how they're performing against each severity level. The second is mean time to respond. You know, depending on the maturity level of your security team, this could be beneficial to look at, or maybe it's not the right metric. But it helps you kind of evaluate, are you addressing those high-risk critical severity levels first? What we've seen sometimes is the time to remediate for low findings is super fast, but sometimes it takes longer for the criticals and the highs. So why is that? Start digging in that. If you don't have that metric, it's hard to really, understand the whys behind it. And then the next kind of three I would pair together maybe, looking at that rate of open to closed issues. But don't look at that maybe in isolation. And I'd say that's maybe a general rule. Like there's not always just one metric that leads your program. There's a slew of metrics that are important to you. But with the rate of open and close, this goes back to that game of like whack-a-mole. Like, are you just closing issues to see more and more reopened? Or are you able to be a little bit more proactive and learn from whatever you're fixing? So things to kind of look at is like the retest reoccurrence. Do you need to retest things often? Are you patching one thing only to find that you can't actually close that because you exploited something else? So looking at the number of times you're retesting. And then, the vulnerability reoccurrences, that could kind of tell you a lot. Again, like, do they just keep popping up over and over again? All in all, there's really like no shortage of data that security teams can have at their disposal. Again, I think it really goes back to making sure you understand that business intent and then being able to pair those metrics, what the business goals and objectives are. The last sort of note I had here is just like, be sure to measure what matters for your business. Again, it's not a one size fits all.
As we approach the tail end of our presentation, Molly and I wanted to talk a little bit about peer benchmarking. And how does our security posture compare to others in the specific industry, company size, and any other criteria?
Yeah, I feel like I've heard over and over how important this is, understanding how you compare to your peers. At a really high level, it could help you demonstrate, program improvements. It could help you advocate for increased resources. You're comparing your score against your peers, your competitors. There's a lot of benefits in having peer benchmarking, and I think it really comes into play at like very high level conversations, from a very thematic communication standpoint. Maybe a little caution is like taking these as truth, because there could be a false sense of security in there. No two programs are really the same. No two organizations are the same. So using this as a source of truth and thinking that you're okay could be really risky. So I think it's pairing this with really understanding what your program is and knowing that you do focus on your program, but this is kind of a guiding light that could help in some of those higher level communications. So when we're kind of thinking about peer benchmarking and how to use that information, Nicole was alluding to this a little bit earlier as well. But here's an example of how industry benchmarks could be beneficial when it comes to your business. So in our state of pen testing reports, we started to look at what vulnerabilities were most common within the industries. So we found for SaaS, top vulnerability is cross-site scripting and broken access controls. These probably have not changed since 2003. But again, using this information of like, if our industry is really susceptible to this, how can we be proactive in this? How can we, simulate these attacks? How can we make sure we aren't susceptible to this? And then you could obviously track and manage that. But I think the key word here is using this information proactively instead of reactively. And then again, this all just comes back to one, having your data and then looking at the patterns that start to emerge within that data. Okay, so if I had to wrap this presentation up into one slide, some of the key takeaways I would have for you would be one, make an attempt to try to capture your complete picture of your security program. You know, whether you're using those multiple systems or tools, aim to centralize that information and use APIs and integrations to really help automate some of that process. And then second is, you know, risk is not that one size fits all. Evaluate the vulnerabilities to determine your business risk rating, and then use that rating to kind of prioritize accordingly for remediation.
Use the data you are collecting across your security programs to create the benchmarks and measure against. You would want to keep your metrics for your business objectives that you are setting for yourself. As we were talking about before also, you can't measure it all. So make sure that you are measuring what matters to you and your business. And if you remember one thing, and this is my favorite last takeaway, challenge yourself and your teams to be proactive when it comes to security. Bring security to the forefront of your processes, and because we do not want to play the game of whack-a-mole.
Okay, perfect. So we're at the tail end, and right before we open it up for Q&A, I just wanted to address maybe what are Cobalt and PlexTrack doing to help solve some of these data questions or data problems. So in general, Cobalt, hopefully most of you are familiar with it, but we're modernizing traditional pen testing. Like I mentioned, we're combining that exclusive community of pen testers with the SaaS platform, giving you those real-time insights that could help you remediate quickly and then innovate securely.
PlexTrack is a leading cybersecurity reporting platform. We collect all the data about your assets, findings, normalize them, help users to create reports, or allow managing the complete workflow within our platform itself. This helps in reducing the time for the pen testing and retestings, and hence create the ROIs.
Yeah, and then we're actually working on an integration together. Again, we want to help you pull that data into whatever your centralized system is. So think of it as a Cobalt and PlexTrack integration that's going to start to pull all of the Cobalt pen test data into PlexTrack, so you get that aggregated holistic view.